Welcome to More Than a Jersey. I am Sinead McMahon and I am with Cait Lennon, who is my
co-conspirator.
Yes, in all of this. So both of us come from quite a long line of GAA stock. Cait has a wee bit more of a... you've got a better history than what I have between Alf Murray and your father, and even who some of your family has married into. So she has more of an influence than what I ever have. But we've decided that the history of the club is something that we were founded on, and in talking, we thought this part, it was my thinking that it would be great to get Cait involved in this, because we always do have good conversations. So today's podcast is pretty much actually going to be concentrating on our the pre-1926. Because the men in the High Moss, there was an awful lot of groundwork that had been put in by a lot of other men, and an awful lot of history to the reasons why we came to the day in 1926 that we were then founded. And I thought that was quite interesting, because we're now living in an age where we can wear GAA tops places, where we're not having to duck into hedges. You know, there is a lot more freedom, and there's probably going back in whenever we were founded, it was still a very big taboo for people to say that they were playing Gaelic games.
That's really interesting. That's what I find interesting, because you have to look at, I suppose, the social context and the times and what was going on in Ireland, across Ireland in those times.
Yeah,
and going right from 1888 right through the whole 1916, and then the Civil War and the War of Independence and all of that. And it was a really interesting time, and a difficult time to be founding and growing an organisation such as the GAA.
And especially in 1926, because prior to that, from really around about, even prior to 1916, let's put it this way, there was an awful lot of upheaval in Ireland. There was people, even in 1888, whenever there was foundations, there was still a very much a civil unrest coming from the famine. That's right. There was the land leagues. There was an awful lot. There was probably around about 50 years. There was a lot of turbulence, a lot of building, a lot of... so whenever you start going into your history, and probably this is where I have been a wee classic nerd. I've been fascinated about the fountain days and what was happening for them to create the movement.
Yeah.
And then whenever I started looking at, the 1926, the one thing I kept fighting out from, asking people, do you remember what your grandfather talked about? Do you remember what your dad... And there was no, he didn't talk much. And that was a really big trend. And you're going, because it was still a taboo. They were all proud to be members of the club. They were all proud to be Sarsfield's men.
Yeah.
And anybody playing GAA were proud to be from where they are. And I find it even interesting, even the fact that there was a lot of clubs around this area. Now, we still have a lot of clubs compared to many other towns.
Yeah.
But I find in Ahagallon, I think there was 5 or 6 small townlands, and they focused in townlands because it was easier to quicker disperse.
Yeah.
If there was several, because there was bans in place, especially regarding anything that was going against the grain of what the British control had, and that's what the GAA was seen as.
Yeah.
So I thought that was really interesting, but also how much the GAA played a role in the communities.
And still does, of course.
Massive,
So that's always been there from the foundation.
And I think that, is something, we've always said that, we've always felt Sarsfields was a community club, and probably anybody who wears the GAA crest, they all say exactly the same. But I find it interesting too that we're from Armagh. And way back, whenever the first foundations of the GAA, that we became a recognised organisation, that Armagh were one of the very first counties to also join that. and yet its role even going into the early part of the 1900s, it was sitting there. It was still not massively growing, but the clubs were filtering in. And like I had been looking over some of the town, some of the small clubs that were back then. And probably from my end of things, it was very hard because there's not admin, so I'm relying on books and books and books and trolling through the internet and to find out, like in 1901, like not 1901, I'm going back to the Bible of the Sarsfields that was wrote, which your daddy had a hand in. I mean, in 1908, there was a couple of clubs in the local area, all bordering the South Loch shore. You had the Dalcassians, which I'm assuming they would have actually been out round about Derrymore direction. Then you've got the Shamrocks in Ochagallen, which would now be known as St Mary's. You've got the Davits of Lurgan, which is Clonagale now. You've got Owen Rose in Glenavy. They're still, they disbanded and I think they got kick-started again. You've got the O'Donnells in Crumlin, who feature as our very first competitive team. You've got the Harps from Balmaclose. They're just out round that direction too. The Dwars, that were a feeder club going into Clonagale. You've got Shane O'Neill's from Ballyganiff. And they were the teams in this area from the early days. Yeah. So that's quite a lot.
That's a lot of teams, yeah.
And like
a lot of rural teams there.
Yeah.
Too, I should say.
That, and then you're going into like the 1910s and you've got, now there is a club, Arrogue. They were a Lurgan club, not the Arrogue that is now.
Today, yeah.
There's no real feeder club associated with them. They were just like the Davits and the Dwars. They would have been just a generic team. And as far as I can see, there might have been around Shankill area too.
Why so many, do you think? Was it because people were just trying to gel within their own local community and come together and, could see what was happening on the broader kind of political, social side of things? Or
yeah, well, it was like any of the reading, a lot of the clubs that we're starting to find was sort of also, it was an act against soccer and rugby were becoming quite dominant, and they were slowing the growth of any Gaelic games. There was a decline, well, not even a decline in Irish culture and heritage, but an ignorance being shown towards it that people weren't allowed, to do this. And it was, I think there was, it was a defiant nature for some communities.
Yes.
And like sometimes these clubs were not what we would now know today as hundreds of people.
Absolutely.
You're talking maybe about 10, 11 men. And I mean, that's what I find even brilliant, is that it was 10 and 11 men and it was a killing spree on the field and it was last man standing. Like, no wonder fixtures were so lacking, because you could not guarantee a league. It's not the way that it is now, and even going back and seeing, like, I think at one stage there was 21 men on a field if you were lucky at county level. I mean, could you imagine? 15's bad enough with handbags, imagine 21.
And the lack of facilities as well, I'm sure.
It was just a field.
Yeah.
There was none, like, I mean, I will later on be doing a tour of our very first field, and I can tell you this much: a lot of the senior men, not a hope would they play on this field. It's at an angle, it's a hill, and some of them may be put to the test with their kicking skills to see how they could even score a point, using what we now have. Because even the balls back then, they were heavy balls. They were not the way that we, what we now know, like, soft and lofty, that you can get a bit of height.
And the kit, the boots. And the
boots, you were lucky if you had boots.
You had a pair of boots, yeah.
You were lucky. I mean, there was talks that there was people, like, literally just going out in their shoes and their working boots. So that would have been very interesting on its own, seeing these men with a mixture of football boots and the likes of their working boots all set to one side.
You used to see them in those old pictures wearing caps as well whenever they were playing football.
You would have even had maybe one or two with pipes in there, like, I mean, I would say like it's night and day,
Yeah.
But I mean, it was all about going out and having a bit of, it was about football, and it was about camaraderie. Now, there is stories that we will tell about, about their understanding of the rules. It wasn't about that, in the early years. Some people did know about it, but I think it was trying to keep a community together, trying to give a community a purpose, and also being a wee bit taboo, trying to...
Bit of resistance against what was happening on the wider...
Because, like, if you think about it, right, you've had the First World War, which was a turmoil time because a lot of soldiers, even if they were a nationalist in nature, were away fighting in a war.
That's right.
And then they were coming home. And that was, that would have been a very hard time. And then in the midst of that, you had the 1916 Rising, which was a massive Kickstarter, probably the biggest Kickstarter for the Irish Revolution. And, that then led into the Irish War of Independence, which we all know was... Even we've all watched, the movies and trying to figure out what side that you would have been sitting on, I think would have been a tough call, and you always hear them talking about, that it was brothers against each other, fathers against sons. And, and in that vein, I also found that, around 1919, 1920, a lot of the clubs that I've just talked about, including our neighbours, they founded in 1917 and they disbanded. They disbanded in 1920, not to be reignited again in 1925. And that was all because after 1921, the GAA realised that they had to do something about trying to keep the communities in the north going. So it was a hard time. Politics wise, I would say that it would have been very challenging because you've got bans in place that were already there.
Yeah.
You've got resistance that were sort of already brought in because you're talking Bloody Sunday. And I think this is actually something that I'm finding that a lot of clubs down-tooled around 1920. Now, whether they did it before or after, we don't really know. We just know they don't feature in 1921.
Yeah.
And, that whole Bloody Sunday, I know, still lived very strong. And, like, we still talk about it as if it was only a couple of years back. And yet we're generations now that it wasn't in our lifetime.
And what was the sense, do you think, of the North? The 6 counties of the North. What was the attitude from the rest of the the GAA in general to the 6 counties? Were we helped? Were we ignored? Were we left on our own?
Yeah, well, look O'Toole. So I think he is a very interesting character because right up until this point, we had presidents who were trying to bring structure, trying to bring something to it. But Luke O'Toole came involved with us in 1910. And in 1910, he started bringing in the likes of fixtures, likes of structures. He was the president of the GAA. And, he was the linchpin, basically, right up until 1929. So he was still the president whenever we were affiliated and we were recognised. And the one big thing that he done as soon as treaty happened was he started bringing out directives and trying to make sure that the 6 counties never felt alienated.
Right.
And so much so that there was a convention in 1923. So there was 2 conventions. There was an All-Ireland convention, which we would know still today, as the annual convention. It wasn't so much annual back then. It would have only happened if needs be.
Right, yeah.
And then there was an Ulster Convention. So this man was also the person who brought in the provincials, councils, which are still running to this day and very, very strong on it. And so he was one of the main people who created the Ulster Council. And in that whole annual convention, he then decided, Well, he put it out to everybody that he wanted the 6 counties to be recognised. So Ulster was not going to be recognised as 3 counties in one province. It was going to be recognised as 9 counties.
Right.
And I think that set a massive trend.
Absolutely.
And then later on that year, he then focused very heavily in Ulster.
Okay.
So he looked at what we can do, what we can provide, and what we can actually bring to Ulster to stabilise it.
Good. Yeah.
Because at the end of the day, anybody who has read about partition, it was a hard time for a lot of people. There was places like South Armagh, Newry, even Tyrone were not going to be recognised. And unfortunately, Tyrone got slotted in there because they wanted Fermanagh. And they realised that, with Armagh and Newry, they're barges, so there was an economic and political gain for them keeping those places on. Unfortunately for us, we were always going to be in the partition. Yeah. And I find that really interesting because we were in the heartland of where a lot of our voices were not in the majority. And that we were still trying to make sure that our identity and what we stood for wasn't going to be lost.
Yeah, so there was a cultural element to it all as well.
Big cultural element, and I think that's, that was the interesting thing, as I said, there's a lot of stuff like Irish language, like we were very forward thinking in that, Mark, from very early doors. And there was a rule in the GEA. Now, just before we came in, I just said, and I was like, I just found this rule. And it was on field was all about the community and building your community and building structures within your, or off the field, sorry. Off the field was about community and building those types of structures. On the field was about the 15 men playing the game. And I was like, isn't that such a lovely, I just think that's a lovely rule. Do you know, and it sums up the GEA.
Well, it's an ethos that's still there today, especially in clubs like the Sarsfields.
Yeah. I mean, it took me to look, I was looking for a book called that exact phrase, and then I discovered this rule. And as a nerd who's actually sat down and read the rule book, I've never came across it, so I just thought that was really fascinating.
Yeah.
But like, what do you think? What do you think? On the lead up to it about what was going on in this area? From your own, because your daddy would have been a young boy.
He would
when all of this upheaval was happening. So like, did he ever tell you about those things?
Well, not really, because he spent some of his youth in America, and came back here when he was about 12. But immediately was absorbed into Derry Trasna and into the football. And I suppose for a young lad of that age, what would that been sort of mid 1920s?
Yeah.
It was probably an outlet for him, and a way, I suppose, for him to make friends as well with young lads that he didn't grow up with.
Yeah.
So I suppose I can see there where it's the wider community thing with him, would have been with him as well, And I mean, we know about certain figures in the community, the local priest or whoever it was that would have encouraged the football and the club through school. So that's all, I can see how all of that influenced him. And that's the kind of things he would have told me about his youth, And
I think that's lovely, because the youth was a big part. So I think in 1923, in that annual convention, one of the big things was getting clubs to reform that had disbanded, which I find really interesting because, as I said, our neighbours are just literally 1 year behind us. I know they celebrated their year, 1917, which was their founding year. So I just think in 1925, I think it's really interesting that around that time after this annual convention in Ulster, that there's teams coming about. Now, there was a handful of teams that never disbanded. I think Davids, they went away and then they came back again, I think 1923. I'm hoping that I've said that correctly. I'm working off the top of my head here. But, there is teams like that, and this all fitted into the 1923 convention where they were trying to stabilise fixtures, trying to harmonise, the whole community. And at the end of the day, there was a lot of people, like, I think I want to emphasise that around that time, people within the GEA were still being targeted by certain elements of the community and forces. You know, prior to even, you know, 1920, like there was bans put into place. So there was the bans like the 1906 ban, and that was foreign games, wasn't it? And then I know in my lifetime, I remember sitting waiting for the outcome of Rule 21, and that was in 2001, because that was where, you know, it was all about the British forces.
And Crown forces.
Yes. And, you know,
which went wider actually than just
it was. I mean, like you're talking about, you know, like it was one of the debates that even from its foundation was debated quite readily over the years. I think I had give you before whenever we were just chatting. So like it was in 1923. It was brought up in 1908. It was brought up in the 1960s, 1962, 65, 68. A public inquiry was put in 1959. It had also been promoted and had tried to be imposed, but it was knocked down spectacularly in 1918. And again, it was brought up in 1923 and again in 1926, which is our fountain year. But this was banning a wide range of our community.
Yeah.
So you're talking civil servants, teachers, Garda, bankers, postal staff, you know,
any public servant.
Any public servant that they got their money from the government. They were completely they were banned. And like there is stories later on, like, you know, Dr. Hyde, or he was the president of Ireland, and he basically lost his presidency because he went to a soccer game. You know, and I just think that is just you know, it's in our thinking, you know, he was doing what he had to do, which was dutiful as the president. Now there is a lot of other politics around that one, but it was just a sense of like how strong these feelings were.
But can't you see it, Sinead, though, even in more recent, in the Troubles, as we talk about as well, you know, and even now the outcome after the Good Friday Agreement, there's still those tensions there, you know.
Like, I mean, I'd be the first one to say, like, even though I played rugby and all the rest, you know, like there's always this wee thing inside me where I feel bad about wanting to play rugby. I loved rugby, like my sons play soccer, and I feel like I'm nearly cheating on the GAA, you know, and you're not, you're just playing another sport. But it just shows you how that's built into our community, even still to this day. And I know that there is people who would still be very diehard, you know, about it. And yet our founding fathers, you know, some of our meetings actually happened, you know, in 1888 and prior to that, were on cricket fields, you know, in Parnell Park, you know. So I just think that that's even really interesting, is that, you know, you would never put cricket and GAA into the same, but yet, you know, it all came about where they seen hurling being played in a field. And, you know, those men, you know, as soon as they seen the army, literally had to throw their hurls into the hedge or jump into hedgerows. Or there were stories about them taking out spades and starting to dig up the field that they were playing football in, you know, because they couldn't be seen to be playing this sport. You know,
also the length that some of them went to get a game.
I mean, I know that in like one of the stories that we had, I had just posted up on social media about in 1926, you know, we had, what was it, a group of 10, 11 men cycle for nearly 10 hours to Crumlin to play their very first competitive game. I mean, you would never ask our senior teams to even cycle to the Wolf Tones, never mind asking these men. And, you know, I think we had been chatting about, and you know, there would have been passports and stuff, you know, like they would have had to have some sort of IDs on them, you know, in case they were stopped. How did it look, 10, 11 men cycling down a road? You know, was there cycle clubs back then?
Barely a road, you probably too.
Because I know that track is very well used by cyclist clubs, you know, to this day. But I mean, you know, I just think it was a brave move for the time that it was in, where there was still an awful lot of civil unrest happening. And identity was something you were told that how you identified was maybe not the same as those who wanted you to identify as something else. And you became a quick target, you know, and as you said, we seen that in the Troubles too. Well, I didn't see it in the Troubles. I've only seen the video footage. But like, I know in some interviews that I've already had, you know, they've talked about the helicopters, you know, arriving in the field. I know at the back of my house and up here, I seen Chinooks, you know, landing, you know, so it was, you know, I just think that there is an awful lot of repetitive history for us.
Absolutely.
And, you know, for them, it must have been scary, and yet it was an interesting time for them to be brave enough to go, you know what, we want to get this together, you know. It had been reported, I think I said earlier on, that soccer was being played in fields around here. And that was a wee bit of where they were going like, no, we can't have that, you know. This is something that, you know, is part of us, you know, and that's what they wanted to make a mark on, is get this football club up, bring back a community environment. And my God, 100 years later,
didn't it work?
You know, where we are
We've
now.
a lot to be thankful to those men for.
Yeah, and it's interesting because even if you wanted to go back with names, the names that found us are names that are really prevalent, you know, in this club. Like, I think I've only found that there's only one man that doesn't have family connected to this club to this day. To this day. But the family, now, I'm not saying his name because I have just discovered that his family have been starting to comment under some of our posts, and I've been searching for, because it's I'm waiting on the 1926 census, and this is my problem, is that there was the last census was 1911, and I think that actually tells you everything too about the structure of what was happening. Like, the last census was 1911, so I'm talking about like men that were 6, 7, 8 years old in 1911. Some of them just maybe entering an early, you know, teenhood. And then all of a sudden in 1926, you know, there were grown men, you know, they were, you know, they were establishing in the club. And little did you know, like, there was a couple of Tyrone men. Like, I did look back just to see if I could find, you know, family connections. And some of the members from Loughlin, like, I think the youngest was 5. You know, like, little did he know in 1911 he would be actually crossing over the Blackwater, the River Bann, to come and play for Sarsfields. You know, I just think that it's, you know, the history and the foundation of this club is just, it's dramatic. It's inspiring.
It is.
It really is inspiring.
It is. And as you say, that the roots are still there after 100 years, the same names, the same families. One thing I'll just say, we're talking about men, and in those days it was men who seemed to be dominant. I'm sure the women were there somewhere in the background doing their bit, but
hedges.
No doubt that is a subject of another podcast.
It is. Women were banned from the sidelines. So I always find it really interesting whenever you're watching certain films and they show the GAN women in the crowd. That would have been a massive taboo. We all know women make up quite a lot of the club now these days, and actually are the heartbeat of most clubs. And I'm not being biased. You know, it is, you know, like, the men do a lot around the club, but the women just see these wee things that, you know, the men can do. But it's like and even in a home, you know, there is, I'm not generalizing, you know, there is some men that are fantastic at just doing everything. But back then, women weren't anywhere near, they weren't allowed anywhere near the football grounds. And I find it really interesting, as two women sitting here talking about our club. I did get told a story about Father Fagan. So Father Fagan will be coming up in the next one, because he had just been elected as a priest to this area in 1926, and he discovered them playing their very first thing. I don't know whether he turned up to do last rites on the field or what it was, but he turned up anyway. But he would have scolded and turned anyway and shamed women at mass, so I've been told, who turned up to football matches. And like, you're probably going like, oh my God, that's really tough. But I was like, no, because women only had one place. You know, there wasn't too many working women, and any working women were working in crafts, or, you know, they were cleaning, or they were doing, you know, their labour was because maybe they married a farmer, or their daddy was a farmer, you know. So whenever you're looking back at this time, it's not like today where
Yeah.
If you told a woman to get back into the kitchen, I can tell you this much, you were not going to be met with a very pleasant, a very pleasant response.
Yeah.
But at the same time, the women did do an awful lot, around here between, like, okay, yes, an awful lot of women for years done jerseys and all. But actually back then, even food for after, there was none of the way we have like after food for players and stuff. But the travelling men coming across would have been given their hospitality.
Yeah.
So they would have been fed and watered and maybe a bed for the night. So women played a vital role in making sure that these players got cared for. And I think, in a way, they may not have been able to go to the matches. And I have been told there was women who would have literally snuck into bushes to watch the games. And I have been told there had been down here now, not in particularly down here, this would have been in other parts of the county, where there would have been some women try to dress up as men to actually play the sport.
I wouldn't be surprised.
And I think that, that would be, to have those types of stories, I think would be amazing.
Well, as I say, probably a separate podcast. Just
very much so. The whole LGFA and the women in clubs will definitely be.
I think we've given a bit of a context anyway as to where things were just in that turbulent time prior to the formation of the club, and just, where things were in general.
No, definitely. And I think it'll be a nice lead, because the next chapter is all about those men and what happened in the 1920s that brought us into a very successful 1930s and 40s period. So
excellent.
I just think fair play to those men. And I'm generalising the men because it was anybody who really wanted to fight for the GAA and bring purpose to their community, because they went against the grain, very much so.
And we wouldn't be here talking about it today if it wasn't for them.
No. So there will be a few more interviews that will be coming in line in between these periods. So pop over and enjoy. And if you have any information that you're wanting to get over to us, you can email highmosssarsfields@gmail.com, or just come over and ask me. Most of you have my number, so you know just to give me a text. But thank you. Bye.